Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Chin Dow, Chair of the Architecture Committee at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs, such as the one you're seeing today, to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. The galleries are open to the public 7 days a week, so please join us. There's a lot of great exhibitions going on right now. On behalf of our Architecture Committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's events, Historic Houses of the Hamptons, or Hampton Houses in the Gilded Age. For more information, I'll let our speaker talk about it. Following the conversation, there will be a Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions that you might have. All right, welcome to a rare view into the great resort homes that made the Hamptons, often referred to as the American Riviera, one of the premier resorts of glamour, luxury, and architectural achievement. Woolden Manor, the Jesse Woolworth Donahue home, Black Point, the H.H. Rogers Mansion, Henry Francis DuPont's Chestertown House, and many more. Architect, author, and historic Gary Lawrance is principal of Lawrence Architectural Preservation in Stony Brook, New York. Lawrence has an extensive background in the history of the Gilded Age architecture, landscapes, and society, and co-authored the best-selling Houses of the Hamptons, 1880 to 1930, with Anne Zirkin. And without further ado, I'll pass it off to Gary Lawrance. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you all for attending today's program.
Thank you, Jen. I wanted to thank the National Art Club for asking me to give you this presentation this evening. I'm sure most people are familiar with the Hamptons, and certainly the Hamptons of today. Well, the Hamptons over 130 years ago was also the place to be. I do a lot of work on Gilded Age architecture and history, and I do social media for Mansions of the Gilded Age. And many times we do a lot about Newport, and Newport was always considered the premier resort. And the Hamptons and Tuxedo Park and the Berkshires were sort of like considered little Newports. Well, today the Hamptons certainly is the star of fashion and society and all that. And we're going to see the houses that made the Hamptons what they were in the Gilded Age. So let me start here. So houses and gardens of the Hamptons during the Gilded Age. So in the beginning, there was the beach. And that's what people went to the Hamptons for, because in the Gilded Age, before the age of air conditioning, no matter how wealthy you were, the cities were always full of, very hot and obviously horse droppings. And you had diseases too, but people wanted to get to fresh air, especially in the summers. So the resorts and the beaches of all along the Atlantic coast were where people went. And places like the Hamptons and Newport and the Jersey Shore, where people built what they call summer cottages. Of course, the more money you had, the bigger your cottage was. But in the very beginning, and for those who are familiar with Southampton, this is the beach club in Southampton, the beginning of society in the Hamptons. But if there's a founding father of the Hamptons, we have a Dr. Theodore Gaylor Thomas, who was a prominent New York physician who visited Southampton in the 1870s. He finds it to be a refreshing, healthy place and decides to buy some oceanfront land to build a summer cottage. The cottage, with its many wraparound porches, became known as the birdcage. Now, I will refer to it, I'm sure not everybody's been to the Hamptons and knows it very well, but for those who have been to, and Southampton in this talk is one of the areas we're going to focus on more, because Southampton really had an earlier start, because the train went to Southampton first and then eventually went to East Hampton. And I always like to make a little joke about it because it took longer to get to East Hampton in the Gilded Age because the train didn't go and you had to take a carriage. And I always joke that today, with all our modern cars and everything, it takes just about as long with all the traffic going to the Hamptons to East Hampton from Southampton. But anyhow, we have this area near Lake Agawam, and we see the Dr. Thomas House here, which plays a role throughout this talk. We in the background with the peaks, I forgot in the Zoom we can do pointers. This is the later incarnation of the Southampton Bathing Corporation, and this is Lake Agawam here. But he then tells all his New York Society friends and patients that Southampton and the ocean was an excellent place to spend their summers, who will then buy property nearby along the ocean in Lake Agawam. Now, the Betts family was one of the first families to build a large summer cottage in Lake Agawam. In the very beginning, obviously, Southampton is one of the oldest, communities in the United States, and it basically had, regular houses, had a main street, and those who came out to the Hamptons for the summer would sometimes rent in hotels and houses along South Main Street, but eventually they sought to erect their own individual cottages, which were basically private homes. So this house actually does still exist today, fortunately, and it looks very much like that. And this is the foot of Lake Agawam. So the Betts family had gone on the so-called Grand Tour and went to Venice. And when they came back from Venice, they liked gondolas. So they had a gondola constructed for their house in Southampton, and they had one of their staff. And on Sundays, they would go from the dock at this house that was actually very near the Dune Church, get into their gondola on Lake Agawam, and he would sort of paddle them across maybe, 100 feet to where they can get off at the dock and then go to the Dune Church, which existed and still does. So once again, for those familiar with Southampton, this scene is pretty much, hasn't changed much except for some of the buildings and the orientation. But we have the Dune Church, which has moved a few times with hurricanes, but pretty much it's always stayed in that location. The building with the two flags is another version of the Beach Club. The Beach Club obviously kept getting blown away in hurricanes and so on and so on. Eventually was replaced by more of a stone and stucco building, which is there today. And once again, in the background here, we have the so-called Dr. Thomas House with the 4 porches. This is Lake Agawam. And if you're there today, there's a very big parking lot for the Beach Club. And there's a dock, which I think is still there today. So this establishes the beginnings of the Southampton summer colony. Now, the book Houses of the Hamptons, 1880 to 1930, was part of a series called The Architecture of Leisure. When I was speaking to the publisher, Barry Senauer from McCanthus Press, we were discussing books about the great resorts. So I had mentioned that, well, Newport's been done and the Berkshires has been done and there's other resorts. And then just off the top of my head, this is like in 2003, so it's quite a while ago. The book came out in 2006, 2007, and reissued again in 2013. But I had said, I don't think anyone has ever done a book on the Hamptons and the Gilded Age. The colonial period has been covered, the modernist period has been covered. So it kind of came up and said, well, why don't we do that? So basically, we always, when Ann and I were working on the book, we kind of joked about all the social activities of those in the summer in the Hamptons. And the idea was that one played tennis, one viewed tennis, one went to the beach dressed up in appropriate beach attire. Things have changed a lot in so many years. And of course, you also had houses with their own private golf courses where you could practice before you went off to the other major golf courses. Now we have a Mrs. Goodhue Livingston of Old Trees, and she was considered Southampton's first lady, or dictator as some thought, and had the final say on social acceptability. For those who may have been watching The Gilded Age on HBO and all about the Mrs. Astor of the 400, and she was the queen of society, and let whoever was in the 400 and people who want to get into the 400. Well, Mrs. Astor obviously summered in Newport, but not every family summered in Newport. Some summered in the Hamptons and other places. So Mrs. Livingston, who had married Goodhue Livingston, and basically the Livingston family from old New York. It's a very prominent family. So she was Southampton's Mrs. Astor. Their house, Old Trees, 1912, was by architect Goodyear Livingston. For those who are familiar with the North Shore of Long Island and Georgian style brick houses, Trowbridge and Livingston was an architecture firm. They did a lot of the also Beaux-Arts houses and grand Georgian houses that are brick and slate roofs. Well, here we see almost a Beaux-Arts house with basically clad in shingles. The massing is similar to a sort of Georgian layout and has a service wing. And it's called Old Trees because a lot of land that it's on have many old trees. And fortunately, this house still exists today, and most of the property is intact. And I'm going to show you some more views of this. Now, once again, I like to refer to the Gilded Age series because it's been very popular. And they always talk about the old money and the new money. Well, the Livingstons was certainly old money, and they didn't have any need to impress with huge marble staircases and fancy chandeliers and velvets and all that, sort of a la Newport. The Livingstons were very comfortable just with their sort of inherited furnishings. So here we see the main entrance hall in the upper left, and we see some portraits there, and there are portraits throughout the house. Some stories had said when people would come and visit Mrs. Livingston or the Livingstons and comment on the portraits, and some might even say, where did you get those portraits? And she said, well, in a sense, we didn't get these portraits. These are portraits of our ancestors that have been in the families for hundreds of years. So she felt quite secure in her position. And here we have the living room in the upper right. We have a dining room sort of in white there. And then we have one of the back porches of Old Trees. Now, one doesn't realize in the Gilded Age, in the hot summer months before air conditioning was popular, that most of these houses were situated on the water to capture breezes from the water, and but they also had a lot of awnings because you wanted to keep out the sun. So these large houses that we see today really don't have awnings, but architecturally and from a sort of a perfection point of view, the awnings, which were usually either green and white or pinks and blues. Some were very elaborate in Newport. They were really, almost as elaborate as some of the dresses the ladies wore, but they, and some had monograms on them. But the awnings were very important to keep out the light, and a lot of living in the Hamptons in summer resorts was spent on porches on these wonderful wicker chairs. We see the portraits here on the left and on Lake Agawam. And you can see it's a large house, and fortunately it's been restored. And it's still currently lived in as a private residence. And here we have the boat here. For those who are familiar with the Great Gatsby and the so-called green light that goes to Daisy's dock, the idea was that if you lived on the water, whether it was on Long Island Sound or lakes or little harbors, you basically took smaller boats to go from one house to another. And everybody had a little dock. So of course these houses weren't lit up brightly as they are today, and the other street lights and so on. So when you got into the boat, with usually maybe somebody from your staff would row you to the next house across the water for a dinner party or a social event. And when you came back in the evenings, you would know that once the mist came in and it was very dark, maybe the Livingstons had a sort of blue light, and so they would row towards the blue light. Or if they were going to visit somebody else, they might go to the red light or the green light. So that's the significance of the colored lights at the end of the docks. Now we have the Shinnoka Hills Golf Course, 1892, one of the earliest buildings of Stanford White, the architect. And we have some ladies here. And while researching the book, it was funny to go through the old Southampton Press, microfilm or microfiche for anyone who knows what those things are. Today, everything's online. This book was written pretty much before the internet. We used to just go through bits and pieces, but today it's very different. But anyhow, this is the wonderful Shinnoka Hills Golf Club, which also does still exist, has been expanded a bit. And one of the stories we found was that people complained even in the Hamptons. Despite beautiful surroundings and the serene environment, the Southampton Press in 1899 reported some visitors desiring more. Some of the summer visitors have announced that they will die if something is not forthcoming in the way of excitement. As one woman says, it's all very well to talk about air. There doesn't seem to be anything down here but air, and heaven knows we will have enough of that to get heartily sick of it. So in 1900, Dr. Thomas sells a portion of his land to another doctor, Dr. Peter Wyckoff. So here we see that house again, which was called the Birdcage, and on the dunes, and he sells off the northern half to Dr. Peter Wyckoff. Southampton had a lot of doctors, mostly because it was like a spa and a resort. A lot of patients came out there for their health. So there were a lot of early doctors who had built houses in the Hamptons and Southampton. Dr. Wyckoff's idea of a cottage is a 58-room summer cottage. And many people ask why these houses were so big. Well, these houses are in many ways like hotels, and about a third of the house is devoted to service. So the wing to the left here we see, while it doesn't really look like a servant's wing, and part of it certainly was some guest rooms, most of it is devoted to service, meaning pantries, kitchens, storage rooms, servants' rooms, and so on and so on. Even though the summer house, you still needed a large staff, because the people who came and entertained, they certainly didn't do anything themselves. And in those days, unlike Hampton's houses today, the kitchen was a place you never wanted to go to, but today that seems to be a major feature of new houses. And for reference again, at the edge of Lake Agawam, the dock, this is the house that's called the Wyckoff House. In the early years, these houses, like I said, were kind of like, it's a funny thing about the Newport versus Southampton. And in many ways, the Southampton always sort of prided itself that it wasn't as frivolous and ostentatious and covered with gold like Newport was, and somehow Newport used to sniff that it was the second Newport, or a place where people should go to practice before trying to break into Newport society. There's so many comments, which is quite amusing. But here we can see the interiors, and they're quite comfortable. Funny thing about the houses of the Gilded Age, those in the houses today, or any houses, summer houses, it's all about glass. And if you're on the ocean, you want to see the water. In the Gilded Age, most houses were very much enclosed with draperies and things, and you went out into the porches to appreciate that. But here we have basically some classic interiors here. Now, the Wyckoff's also gardens were incredibly elaborate and often featured on charity garden tours. As we were reading through the notices of the daily, there was sort of like the summer, the colonists, I think, called the summer colony in the Southampton Press. They did a weekly sort of social column about who is who and who came here and who's opening their house and who's giving a party and who has a distinguished guest visiting for the weekend, and so on and so on. And then they also would have mentions of, the Southampton, let's say, hospital, or Southampton other charities, or other Hamptons charities were giving garden tours to raise funds for their causes, which they actually still do today. I do recommend, if you go to the Hamptons in the summer, do go on some of the wonderful garden tours, because the gardens in the Hamptons are just magnificent. And gardens in the Hamptons were important because the soil is great for, it had wonderful soil, and it had this sort of the cool breezes from the ocean, and has a nice sort of like mist. And basically compare that gardening in the Hamptons is similar to gardening in England, and had an excellent place to have gardens. This is one of the gardens of Mrs. Wyckoff. And for those who, like I said, referring back to the Gilded Age series and Downton Abbey, which is very popular, the idea of these houses are all about maintenance and all about staff. So let's say Mrs. Wyckoff, as an example, would be here on the weekends or spending the summer, and she had some weekend guests, and she would go touring down these alleys of these beautiful, lawns and flowers. And she might comment that, the roses look magnificent this year. We had such a hard time working on them, meaning that Mrs. Wyckoff just had a large staff of gardeners who would perfect them. And you never saw, a dying flower. Everything was deadheaded immediately. And also stories goes about the staff in those days, as they would wander down garden alleys, there would be staff pretty much working in the gardens all the time. Unlike today, where you don't see any staff on weekends, they work on the weekdays. It's a little different world, but the idea is that as they went down, and a gardener might see the lady of the house approaching with her guests, he would kind of run down the next path to tell the other gardeners that were working to get out of the way and jump behind a hedge or a topiary until they passed, because you weren't supposed to see staff working. This even goes through inside, where let's just say there was a maid working in a corridor or hallway of a great house, and a guest or somebody would walk by. There's even stories where let's say the maid is supposed to stand up and face a corner. So it's kind of like, there's so many stories and versions of this. I'm not sure if every household was run that way, but staff was not meant to be seen or interacted with. There are many wonderful garden pictures at the Library of Congress, which of course is online, and you have all these wonderful hand-colored garden views of various gardens in the Hamptons and all through the country. I think it's the Francis Benjamin Johnson collection. So I do recommend taking some time and looking through the maybe hundreds of thousands of images of hand-colored glass garden slides. Another famous house was called the Orchard, 1895. It was built for financier and photographer James Breese. Sort of large colonial revival house. This was on Hill Street, still is on Hill Street. Fortunately, it's condominiums today called Whitefield. In the era when people were building new houses, let's say in Newport with palaces and French chateaux, and certainly we eventually get some of those in the Hamptons too. The whole colonial revival period was very popular. Everybody sort of thought, imitating Mount Vernon was very chic. And of course, every house had big porticos with columns. That's pretty much where it ends as far as imitating Mount Vernon, because they certainly wanted much more luxurious interiors. But this house was designed by Stanford White. It was originally a sea captain's house, and then of course was enlarged greatly. And Stanford White was very good friends with James Breese, and he would visit him frequently on weekends, and they would dabble and redesign the house and add on wings and so on. Decorating in those days basically was very eclectic. People traveled the world, and they almost had theme rooms. You may have had Americana rooms, you would have Roman rooms, you have like a lattice room here with sort of a Roman and Greek style furnishings, which is also sort of like a palm court. You have an American Adam room on the bottom right. You have sort of a mishmash collectible room, which was the living room on the upper right, with this, a bearskin rug, which we often see in the Gilded Age, and it seems horrible today, but they seem to pop up everywhere in every house. And then you had the entrance hall with this wonderful staircase with all these wonderful pictures of semi-curved. Then it had a wonderful mural painted above that. The interior of the house still exists, fortunately. The building has been converted into condominiums, but it's been a very sensitive conversion. James Breese, like I said, he was a photographer, and he was very much part of the artist group in the city, where him and Stanford White and Augustus St. Gaudens and all the other four artists got together, and they had their studios, and they shared stories and entertained, and it was one small little world all by itself. So Mr. Breese had this studio here, and eventually he felt that it actually was could be bigger. The studio actually is above the fireplace. You see a railing there. It's hard to see sometimes with smaller images, but that's where his studio was. But eventually, like I said, collecting in the Gilded Age was pretty much, you just bought everything that you saw, and somehow you would find a place for it. The Americans went to Europe. They had lots and lots of money, and they would just buy fireplaces and ceilings and sets of furnishings and paneling and just ship it all over back to America. And somehow, if they didn't have space, they would build a room for it. So Mr. Breese bought about 1,400 objects on a trip to Europe. And of course, he got back and he needed more space. So he had Stanford White enlarge that previous room into the so-called music room, ballroom, that becomes about 75 feet long by 35 feet wide. And actually, very far in the back, in the left, with the chandelier above it, is a pipe organ. And believe it or not, that's still there today. Of course, it doesn't work. This is a very large room, and it's now used sort of like for parties and events for those who, live on the condominium at Whitefield. I gave a nice talk in this room one day, and it was, of course, had no furniture in it, And of course, we see these poor, rugs on the floor. James Breese's daughter, Frances Miller Breese, once said that he hated people calling it the music room or something, or a ballroom, but she said whenever we wanted to dance, we just had the staff move all the furniture away, and we would have a wonderful time putting on the phonograph and dancing in this space. The gardens at the orchard were magnificent. They were often cited as some of the most magnificent gardens in the country. They were listed in Country Life in America as some of the finest gardens and house. James Breese also went to Capri. When he came back, he wanted a wonderful pergola structure, which he had Stanford White design. The fountain here has changed quite a few times. The pergola structure still exists. It was covered with roses. Unfortunately, the pergola structure does not have the abundance of roses it once had, but the garden does still remain. Mr. Breese was quirky, as most people with money. He didn't like giving money to the local power plant, so he had his own power plant constructed. And since he had so much electric, about 1915, he was able to electrify his entire estate and gardens, and considered to be one of the first electrified gardens in the nation. Now we get to a house that most people probably know, Grey Gardens. 1901, Mrs. Stanhope Phillips. Early view of Grey Gardens actually has been recently restored and looks very much like this again. Most people's mind usually goes to the image of when it was a ruin during the Beale period. But it was a house with always a story. A lady's name should appear in the newspaper only 3 times in her life to announce her birth, her marriage, and her demise. Grey Gardens was in the news even before it was built. The land was purchased in 1895 by F. Stanhope Phillips, but the land had already been gifted to the government prior to the sale. This was only the beginning. So eventually they do settle with the government and get the land back. But by that time, Mr. Phillips has gotten older and had some issues, and so eventually he passes, and of course he leaves his entire estate to his second wife, Mrs. Phillips. Of course, his family contested that. So in the New York Times of March 6th of 1901, had her husband cremated. Contestant of will says it was to conceal his mental condition. A new will contest with some remarkable features was developed in the surrogate's court yesterday morning. The whole contest hinges practically on the disposal of a man's head. An autopsy was performed on his body, but the head was not touched. It was cremated with other portions of the body, and now the brother comes into the court and alleges that the testator was incompetent to execute a will. So some things have never changed. Anyhow, it was settled. I believe the brother did acquire some money, and Mrs. Phillips, without Mr. Phillips, was set to build her house called Grey Gardens. And this is an early view of Grey Gardens without the trees. And the one thing about East Hampton was that it was mostly dunes and grasses. Excuse me. In the background here, we see a little building, which was a, whoops. Okay, could be a little snag with the slides here. 1 second. In 1913, Robert and Anna Hill purchased the estate and created the famed Grey Gardens. Anna Gilman Hill was the director of the Garden Club of America from 1920 to 1926. Here's Anna Hill here in her garden, which is the garden that she calls Grey Gardens and builds that with the enclosed walls. Excuse me as I have a little drink here. Anna Hill wrote a wonderful book called 40 Years of Gardening. And she talks all about the gardens that she did in a Hudson River house and also in East Hampton at Grey Gardens. Excuse me. It was truly a gray garden. The soft gray of the dunes, cement walls, and sea mists give us our color scheme as well as our name. We use as edgings all the low gray flowering, shrubs and plants and so on, artemisias and those kind of things. And so basically, this is her book, and she talks about the design of the Grey Gardens. The Grey Gardens, like I said, unlike some of the more formal gardens and other weekend houses or Gilded Age houses, was meant to be sort of English and very cottage. Here we see the famed, concrete walls that overlook the dunes. For those who know East Hampton and may have, had they gone by Grey Gardens, Agam Park Road and West End. And while that road is private, you can still see the house probably from the corner. In the background, we see the dunes, and here we see the garden. And gardens often were enclosed by walls when they were certainly close to the dunes, because basically it kept all the salt air from damaging the plants. A little bit more unlike Mrs. Wycroft's garden, which seemed a little bit more formal, and some other formal gardens we'll see later. Grey Gardens is pretty much just meant to be a wonderful place to relax. All the structures here still exist of the garden. And then you could view the garden from a wonderful, relaxing porch. Grey Gardens is really very much a truly summer cottage. It's not a pretentious, large, magnificent mansion. It is a wonderful, comfortable house, and it still is today. Hydrangeas were very popular. People love hydrangeas in the Gilded Age, and they're still very popular today in the Hamptons and Newport and other places. So just as Grey Gardens attracted media attention in its early years, it still generates curiosity over a century later by a new generation of news and social media. So in November 2017, Ben Bradley and Sally Quinn had bought the house from little Edie Beale, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, and they renovated and restored the house, bring it back to a more livable condition for those who are familiar with the headlines and the pictures, and there's the film Grey Gardens. And so they lived there for many years, and eventually they sold it around 2000. He died, and Miss Sally Quinn wanted to, she sold it. And in 2017, there was a tag sale, which I've been to many so-called tag sales and estate sales at these large houses, and usually famous houses. And sometimes at these sales, old frying pan will go for $100 because of the provenance. So I wasn't prepared to buy anything, and I went there like early in the morning, and people had gotten there at 4:30 in the morning, and the doors open supposedly at 8. I didn't get until 11, but like I said, I had seen the house on garden tours and house tours, but I thought it was fun to wander. But basically it was about thousands of people, lingering around the road, waiting patiently to get into line. And pretty much they did buy everything. They even claimed that people bought tops of pots and so on. And I did find a few little things, certainly nothing from the Beale period, but it was fun to see it. And the 3-day sale basically had thousands and thousands of people who went, and it was covered in the media heavily. And it was almost like a party scene. Everybody was so excited to be there and share stories that they knew of Grey Gardens. Now we have another house called Black Point, 1916, Henry Huddleston Rogers. Houses in the Hamptons that are really on the beach are definitely different than a Newport house, which is pretty much on Bellevue Avenue, except the Ocean Drive. And the first entrance is usually the basement level. So you would drive, this house was at Old Town Road at the end of Gin Lane. And unfortunately, it does not exist anymore except for the walls. But the idea is you came into the lower entrance here. It's sort of like, Italian, Mediterranean style house. Walker and Gillette, very famous architects, designed it. And it's a very large house, which we'll see some views of this. So you go into the front door, which is on, like I said, the first floor basement level. Then you went up a staircase, beautiful flowers and stucco walls and tapestries. Too bad we don't have color pictures, but very well documented house. Then usually there's sort of like almost like a New York townhouse where you enter a first floor, but your main floor really is the second floor. So in these houses that were on the dunes, they basically had light on the left, which would overlook gardens, and light on the right, which overlooked the ocean from the top of a dune. And this is the living room. The outside sort of breakfast room with wonderful more murals and overlook the gardens. so many of these houses are featured more fully in the book, and it is still available, certainly in libraries and so on. And so basically, there's floor plans. We emphasized in putting a lot of floor plans into the book. And so here from that garden room is the garden. The property was about 300 acres. Imagine 300 acres in a Southampton house. It went on and on. Gardens were designed by the Olmsted brothers, had tea houses, and wonderful, wonderful house. Unfortunately, during the 1930s hurricane, it was pretty much damaged, but sturdy. But Mr. Rogers had passed, and the trustees had decided that the house was no longer needed, and it was demolished. One for watercolor rendering. But Mr. Rogers also liked having a getaway from the social life of Southampton. So in North Southampton, there's a house called the Port of Missing Men, 1926 to 1929, and this was built for Mr. Rogers. There's also an old sea captain's house, and in time, it got added on to. You sort of had like this little part of a boat here on the left here, which is kind of like a bar room. And then John Russell Pope, later on the architect, added some wings, pool room, a library, sort of ballroom, greenhouses, and a tunnel that went from here to there, which we're going to peek at in a second. This property also does fortunately still exist. Mr. Rogers, he had a daughter, Millicent Rogers. For those who know fashion, Millicent Rogers was a fashion icon, and she had married a Count Somm, and she had a son from him. I think it was Peter Somm, and he inherited this property. But when Mr. Rogers built this property, he basically had Eleanor Brown from the decorating firm Macmillan decorate the house, and he wanted something that's very rustic and very different from the Southampton house on the ocean. So he basically said to Mrs. Brown, send the furniture out and whatever you think is right. So she sent truckloads of furniture out to the house called the Port of Missing Men, which kind of got its name because his wife sort of gave it that, saying that, well, the men are missing, they're all at the Port of Missing. It was basically a hunting compound, which was, I think, about maybe 2,000 acres originally. So it was more for hunting and more for men roughing it there to get away from the frivolous life on the ocean. Eventually, Mrs. Rogers does come to the house and she makes her additions. But anyhow, Mrs. Brown claimed that Mr. Rogers didn't want to come to the city to pick up furniture. So she sent, truckloads of furniture out. And she said, fortunately, he kept most of it. So the property over the years stayed in the family, still is in the family. And all the furnishings are pretty much still there. And whenever they need any repair, they're simply replaced with a very similar and restored. So it's a wonderful house. It's still a private home. And it is much bigger than it looks. Mr. Pope, the architect, added this sort of entertainment wing. Sadly, this wing was taken down in the 1940s, but the part that I showed you does still exist. Later, probably the late 1920s, I love the chandeliers in the room. It's definitely showing that sort of deco influence for those who've been to the Union Club on Park Avenue. Some of the interiors there seem very similar, and the paneling. And I love the shared carpeting and that little tiny chair in the beginning, which always probably is a child's chair. But and someone said one time to me that shared carpeting was very popular in the 20s and 30s. I think we all remember it from the 70s, which we didn't think was very popular, but it was. And Mrs. Rogers, they had a Pompeian pool, indoor pool. You might, similar that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think it's been restored actually, not as a pool, but also here we have some wonderful, imagine this is red and black and murals, frosted ceiling. I think it might have been Lalique, I'm not sure. And then we had these wonderful chairs here, all in a wonderful deco style. And there was a tunnel that went to Mrs. Rogers' bedroom. This unfortunately was taken down in the 40s. The Bayberry Lane is another great house, sadly also gone. Charles Sabin and Pauline Sabin Davis. She married Mr. Davis of the Davis Cup. This house is not on the ocean, but on the north side of Southampton. And it basically is a huge sort of English Cotswold style cottage. And in the background, we have a gatehouse, and we have the main house here. Cross and Cross Architects designed it. Also, with most of the Gilded Age houses, everybody was impatient to get into them. They were built quickly, and they also didn't want to wait for the gardens to mature. So Marion Coffin, a very famous garden designer, she basically brought in topsoil from a farm, and this is also called like orange poker plants. Like I said, she purchased the topsoil of a local farm and had it brought it to enrich the gardens. So when the house was done or during the construction, it had full bloom gardens within 2 years. And here's the house here trying to be a cottage house, but it was probably a very large house with about 40 rooms. So almost Lutyens in style. But the interiors, of course, were not very cottagey. Wonderful wrought iron railings by Samuel Yellen, chandeliers, sweeping staircase, and of course the doors overlook the water here, overlook the gardens. Then you have your sort of homage to Americana rooms with, I think it was a portrait of George Washington there, and very casual, comfortable furniture, a little different than the earlier Gilded Age look. Study of this house was eventually became the Electrical Workers Union House, and I think by the early 2000s they disposed of it, and there was some hope of saving it for something, maybe a clubhouse. But eventually, the property was bought for the Sabonic Country Club golf course, and unfortunately, the house could not be saved. They tried. There was plans of many preservation hearings. They claimed it needed too much work to restore. So sadly, the house was demolished and a new clubhouse was built on the site. Chestertown House is a name that most aren't familiar with, but may be familiar with the house that was later made into it. 1926, Henry DuPont. Mr. DuPont, very wealthy family from the Delaware DuPonts. He basically knew, him and his wife knew all the very rich of the Gilded Age and went to their country homes and saw their chateaus and their Georgian palaces. And he thought, well, we're Americans, why don't we build an American style house? Because he loved American antiques. So he wanted a house that was not pretentious, but that could hold his collection of antiques that he was collecting. And he drove his architects cross and cross a little crazy by insisting having garage doors, garages actually, incorporated into the house, because most big houses would certainly have a garage wing, which he later did build a garage wing, but at the time. But the idea was that this looks just like a very nice house, not too big, something you might see like, in a very nice suburban street, in a nice neighborhood. And but it stops there. And once again, we talk about the houses on the dunes. You enter the front door, which is the basement. But Mr. DuPont wanted about 66 rooms. So the house was actually a large house as it climbed up to the dunes. And here we see the house on the dunes on the right. Interesting floor plan. I don't have this in here, but and as those who know, Winterthur is very famous for its Americana collections. And these are some of the interiors to the house. The DuPont house later was sold to someone named Barry Troupin, who made it into sort of a French style house with castle style turrets. It was quite a controversy in the Hamptons in the 80s. Then eventually was bought by Calvin Klein, who eventually demolished that, and he built a modern black box on this site, which I think he has recently sold, and that was on Meadow Lane in Southampton. We have a house, Ballyshire, sort of Georgian style house here, and it's one of the few Georgian style houses, but beautiful interiors. This house, fortunately, does still exist. It was recently, maybe about 10 years ago, bought by Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, and he did a complete restoration of the property. I have not been in it and seen pictures, but I'm sure the interiors are beautifully restored. Then you have these wonderful garden rooms, another relaxing space with awnings. Then beautiful gardens. And according to, I'm sorry, this is Rose Standish Nichols said, Gardens arrived because a man's brawn had been directed by a woman's brain. In those days, the architects tended to be mostly, it was a male-dominated profession, and women pretty much took to landscape architecture and garden design. So they're making kind of idea that the women, did design the gardens, but the men moved all the bushes and the plants around. Then we have Milfiori, House of 1,000 Flowers. This house is sadly gone, was in Southampton on Cooper's Neck. Amazing to think this house once existed. You could see it from all over. I've seen some aerials where you could see it sticking up. But also magnificent gardens. This house was taken down about the 1960s, and property has now been subdivided into 2 new houses. Our last Georgian house is Westerly, 1929, another grand house. These houses are houses you see more like in Locust Valley and Oyster Bay. Well, rhododendrons. Later interiors here. This is a part of the ballroom. Very well, that chintz is definitely 20s decorating. Another sort of like porch sunroom that would overlook the gardens. The house still exists today, has gone through various owners in time. And today, I believe it's still owned by Tory Birch and was restored by her a few years ago. You're the designer. And from what I understand, the gardens are in beautiful condition, and the house certainly is well maintained. People ask me if I have favorite houses. Well, Four Fountains was a favorite house. And it was meant to be a sort of studio art pavilion for a larger house across the street, the Chang family home. And they built it as a house for entertaining. Beautiful deco style. And a large auditorium space. And of course, a stage. Later on, after the Chang's sell the property, Eleanor Brown and her architect husband, Archibald Brown, converted into a residence. So this space became sort of a living room, dining room, and the stage was converted into 2 bedrooms. The house did exist till about 2 or 3 years ago, when the family that had it for many years decided to sell it. Being that it was a very small house, William Paley had owned it one time for his Southampton home. And he basically, then it was sold to another owner. And one would think it would have survived, but the idea, it was near the ocean, had a lot of flooding problems and so on and so on. So it was purchased with the intent of building the facade, then building a larger house behind it. And last time I heard that is the intention, but unfortunately the main house has been taken down just about, I think it was January 2020 before COVID. So then things got put on hold. So I'm not sure what's happening today. I have to go out and see. You can see it on Halsey Neck Road, but there's very little to see. And when people ask me about a favorite house, I had to say The Shallows, 1931, Lucy and Ting. The people who built the studio we just saw, the Four Fountains, this was a big shingle-style house which burned during the construction of the studio. And then they moved into the studio while this sort of international style house was built. And I have to say, I love Gilded Age houses. I love old style houses, but seeing this house when we were photographing it for the book is a magnificent house on the ocean, and really basically just across from the ocean. The views are magnificent, beautiful deco stairs, deco detailing, and still fortunately privately owned. So sometimes I end here, but I think we have a little bit more time to go. But these were topiaries that were at the Erdman property in East Hampton. The house does still exist, fortunately, on Lily Pond Lane, but the topiaries are long gone. We have Mr. Erdman, his wife, and 3 daughters. Imagine maintaining this wonderful. So this is either a goodbye or hello, but we'll continue a little bit and let you know whatever happened to Walden Manor. In 1928, Dr. Wyckoff sells the estate to Mrs. Jessie Woolworth Donahue, who proceeds to turn the house and estate into the most luxurious property in Southampton. We will be going through this quickly. The Donahues renamed the estate Walden Manor. And the house that we opened up that was near, the porch, the bird cage, and Mr. Wyckoff's house later gets redone in a very 20s, very chic style. Mrs. Donahue was, obviously the daughter of F.W. Woolworth, and she wanted to be accepted by society. She had an enormous amount of money, and sometimes that can be your doom too, but she thought she would recreate the house, make it so really spectacular with very expensive items in the house and furnishings and decorators. Waterford chandelier, tapestries. I think it's a very famous painting on the wall there. Might have been Gainsborough, or I'm not sure. I have to double check. And then her husband, James Donahue, in Cleveland Amory's The Last Resort. It's a wonderful book. James Donahue proudly giving a tour of his house, set at the dining room entrance. Come on in and see it. All the silver is gold. So maybe things were a little bit too gilded for Southampton society. This is Mrs. Donahue's bedroom. And wonderful terrace. Now the house, as we know from the very beginning, it faced Lake Agawam because Dr. Thomas's house faced the ocean. So the primary view is of Lake Agawam. But then she was able to buy the Thomas house and knock it down so she could have ocean frontage. And she had a landscaping firm design a beautiful pool house. Quickly, you'll say the grounds of the James P. Donahue estate are conceded to be among the most beautifully landscaped in the fashionable summer colony of Southampton, New York. Hudson Nurseries was commissioned to undertake this landscaping in the spring of 1929. Work was begun in March 29th, and the plan involved whatever, and it just says, and by on the conditions, and by July 1st, it was all completed. So imagine what you're going to see completed in that short period of time. So this is the pool house, which matches the Walden Manor house, which was the Wyckoff house. Basically, it's now on the ocean. This fortunately does exist. The Walden Manor house was taken down in the 40s, but the pool house exists and has been greatly enlarged. So when you're at the beach club and you see a Tudor-style house that looks like a mansion, basically you are looking at the old former pool house, which has had many more wings. The wonderful sort of pool house sort of main living space. Remember, this is a pool house, not a house. Guest rooms and changing rooms, late 20s. Wonderful indoor pool with these lanterns, and it overlooked the ocean. Unfortunately, by the 37 hurricane, that destroyed this extensively, and the pool house was never rebuilt. So when all was done, the Donahues had expected to be invited to join the Bathing Corporation, which was right next door, but no invitation came. As always, sort of like in the Gilded Age series, the Russells want to be accepted by Mrs. Astor, and I guess the Donahues, Mrs. Jessie, Woolworth, also wanted to be accepted, but Southampton society felt they were too showy. Mrs. Donahue was accused of wearing diamonds in the daytime, and that's a funny story. And then some other ladies say later on that, well, I used to feel that way too, but once I got them, I didn't feel so bad about wearing them in the daytime. One of those sort of fables of the Gilded Age. Some say the Donahues were too showy, and they were considered nouveau riche. So here we see the Bathing Corporation here, and we see the pool house on the upper right. However, members of the beach club did come to the glamorous parties through the little door in the brick wall that faced the club, and enjoyed the free-flowing champagne, gourmet food, and dazzling entertainment. But the parties did not last long. Mr. Donahue had some problems with gambling, bad investments, and failed extramarital affairs. Unfortunately, he kills himself. It's claimed a suicide about 2 or 3 years after the house is all completed, so money did not buy happiness. And after her husband's death, Jessie Donahue rarely visits Walden Manor, focusing her social ambitions on Palm Beach, where she had an equally magnificent home, Solito Lindo, which partially still exists. But her son, James Paul Donahue, befriends the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who are frequent guests of Jessie Donahue. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were very popular in American society because everybody wanted to entertain them. And so they were quite good friends. But then Jesse's son, better known as Jimmy, leads a wild, decadent life in search of pleasure of all sorts. And at age 53, he commits suicide like his father. I do recommend a book that talks about James Donahue Jr. and his sort of relationship with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. It's called Dancing with the Devil by Christopher Wilson. A wonderful story. I have to say it's a little on the adult side. But then the property is sold. Nobody wants these houses at that time. Then the mansion is torn down. $137,000 for the house. So in 1877, Dr. Thomas buys the original 14 acres for $3,000. 1900, Dr. Thomas sells half to Wyckoff for $20,000. In 1928, the Donahues pay $150,000. In 1937, the property sells for $700,000, which I think is a complete estate. So a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the entire estate sells for a combined total of $150 million. The pool house still exists. Some of the other lands have been subdivided into new housing. And like I said, you basically can see that if you drive along Lake Agawam at the end of Gin Lane. So Jesse Wooler Donahue survives until 1971, passing away at the age of 85. So I do recommend you take a look at the book, Houses of the Hamptons, 1880 to 1930. Please join Mansions of the Gilded Age on Facebook and Instagram. And these are some sources. There's a great book called Money, Manure, and Maintenance, The Secrets of a Great Garden, and I do recommend The Dancing with the Devil. And take a look at the Library of Congress. So there we are, sort of a quick little synopsis of Gilded Age and the Hamptons. I think we're ready to take questions now.
All right. George asked, despite its proud lack of ostentatiousness, did the old homes of old money have a spinning wheel? Why did the old homes have a spinning wheel on display in their homes?
Well, the idea of Americans and wealthy Americans like to feel that they had those who had colonial roots were proud of that they weren't new money, but just like the new money would be very proud to display furnishings at Versailles, that they could emulate, the court of Versailles, which you see in many of the Vanderbilt houses. So I guess people always like to feel just like they want to emulate, Mount Vernon and so on. But, pretty much it ends there.
That makes sense. I think they all kinds of different things could ornament their homes.
Mm-hmm.
Lynn asked, did many architects and landscape designers compete for work in this area, or was there an exclusive list for that prominent residence favored?
Well, just as today and always, those in the sort of called, the idea is that when you, let's just say, taking a new money family, they of course would feel insecure and want to have the best designers, the famous names, just like sometimes today people buy obviously, the high names of design because it gives a little bit more, impact, but you're wearing this designer or whatever. But you also you'd wanted to hire, McKim, Mead and White, Stanford White, Horace Trumbauer, Walker and Gillette, Cross and Cross. They were always with a Delano and Aldrich with a chic architects. Then certainly the decorators that went along with that, and obviously those decorators and architects and landscape designers were very busy. Most of the great houses were Olmsted brothers and Frederick Law Olmsted, who did Central Park. So a lot of it was putting together a package of saying, well, my house was designed by Delano Aldrich, and my interiors are designed by Elsie DeWolf, and my landscapes were Olmsted brothers. Of course, some of the older families like the Livingstons and those, they often knew their own little group of architects who were part of the so-called world and club. So some of that came mostly from other old families who had architects in the families, and the work went to them. But they were known in their own sort of very small world too. So.
Got you. Yeah, it's very interesting. Gail asks, she's very interested to know how the early builders acquired the land from the Shinnokaks and what happened to them.
Well, a lot of the Shinnecock land, I believe, is in the Shinnecock Hills, and I really can't answer that because unfortunately we started over about 1880, so I'm sure that probably predates that era, and they are that's just something that basically the millionaires went out there with all their money and just bought land right and left. Whoever owned it that they bought it from, I really can't answer.
Yeah, it's a good question. That's something that could do with some more research. We were out there recently, a few weeks ago, and we stopped in Shinnoka and at a lobster shack, and it was half owned by a Shinnecock descendant.
Yeah, most of the Shinnecock Hills was the Shinnecock land, and that was mostly the grasslands where you see the artists of America Sack, William Merrick Chase, who does wonderful fields of flowers, which of course now is all overgrown with pine trees, and those Shinnecock fields are, long grown up. And there was even times when the train, when it came out, would sometimes set those fields on fire because of the sparks from the engines and the wheels, and then all those houses on the Shinnecock lands, the so-called Gilded Age houses would burn down, and they'd just go and build another summer cottage. So.
Right. It seems to be a lot of changeover. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and I have one that I have my own that I wanted to ask you, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
When did any sort of historic preservation societies start in an effort to preserve some of these homes?
Well, I think obviously, as we all know, with New York City, you have Penn Station was the first thing that really was a shame to go. And I think there was, I do a talk on the Fifth Avenue mansions, which gets into a lot more of the New York City preservation movement. I think the houses that are in the resort areas, there's always concern. When Ann and I had started the book about 2003 and published 2007, since that time, many of the houses that are in the book have been destroyed. There's an old adage where it says, sort of like poverty preserves, meaning that those, houses survive when there's no money. But in places like Long Island and very popular places like obviously Fifth Avenue and the North Shore of Long Island and desirable resorts like the Hamptons, where there's a lot of money coming in, everybody always wants to renovate. Palm Beach gets a lot of renovation and or tear down or build bigger. Also, look, I love old houses, but many when these people built these houses in the 1880s, 1900s, 1910s, you wonder, did they want to leave behind something to remember? But I think at their time, they were almost considered disposable. They were just summer houses to just live in and never thought, I think some of the magnificent houses, like thank God the Breakers in Newport still survived because that's a monument. I'm not saying these other houses aren't monumental, but they basically were just sort of, they were just big old houses. And even with the North Shore of Long Island, when they were coming down, people just thought they were just big old houses that needed a lot of work, that weren't insulated properly, and were always needing repair. And the time had moved on, and they just, and look, houses that were mostly wood did tend to burn down a bit. And if you're not maintaining a house like that on the ocean, there's a lot of other issues with weather and so on. And then sometimes they eventually fall to a point where it's too expensive to fix it, so it's easy to tear it down. But yeah, there's definitely a preservation movement in the Hamptons, and they do try very hard. But it is, I think if it's in the village, they have a much more strict, code there about that. And they do have committees and architectural review boards for that. So
great. Yeah, that leads me to my question, which I kind of expected mostly your talk to talk about these sort of grand houses and to see some of the lovely smaller houses. And you kind of answered the question, why did they build so big? Do you ever answer the question, why did they build small sometimes? Was there any particular reason or motivation?
Well, unlike Newport, which had many older houses from an earlier period, the Hamptons had older houses too, which more of the colonial period, but certainly were colonial style and certainly not, able to be on a grander, larger scale. Like, there's all such, whether it's a Newport house or a Hamptons house or other Gilded Age summer house, they called them cottages, which they all started out as cottages and expanded upon. I think the idea, the Hamptons at its time was considered a place you went to not do the big pretentious houses like Newport. The Hamptons was supposed to be more relaxed. And so houses, as we saw some very grand houses in the talk here, but there's a lot of, actually, when Ann and I started the book, we had no idea how many houses there were. The back of the book does have a very large portfolio of houses that aren't mentioned as chapters. And the diversity of architecture, one thinks, oh, well, it happens a lot of shingle style houses. There was a great diversity of architectural styles, and some are big and some are small. I have to say, one of the good things about smaller houses, the small houses tend to survive more than the big houses. Because even when, like with Black Point, the Rogers house, and the DuPont houses and so on, the families had a great deal of money, but they just simply moved on, and they just weren't. They just felt look. It's about fashion. By the 40s, you weren't getting the servants anymore. You had a lot of taxes. People didn't want the burdens of these large houses. You could fly around the world and go to the Riviera and go here and go there and take ships, and life moved much faster. In the Gilded Age, you went to a summer house for the whole summer. Now
Yeah,
today, and even today,
that's interesting. So what would you say now? The pandemic notwithstanding, take that out of the equation. How would it, like in this Gilded Age compared to now, how would you say the sort of entertainment factor or the social factor into sort of like the style of living in the Hamptons today compared to back then?
Well, certainly, I mean, if you were comparing the style of entertaining and living in the Hamptons today or back then, well, there definitely was much more formality. People had very large sit-down dinners, with footmen. There's one little line in the book with Mrs. Livingston. Mrs. Livingston was very vocal about and commented to the media. Most of the society ladies didn't talk to the press. Mrs. Livingston loved talking to the press, and there's lots of stories about her talking to the press. And she said something about, they asked about her in Southampton and Newport, and she said, well, we have footmen in the Hamptons too, but we don't have footmen in satin knee breeches. So that was the idea. The Hamptons was considered a bit more casual, and today, well, writing a book, I certainly got invited to a lot of Hamptons parties in this day, and I still fortunately do. COVID took a little bite out of entertaining, of course. It's still quite nice to. The parties are still pretty spectacular. The big tents, they're great stories about them. People love to entertain, and a lot of entertaining is done more for charity purposes. The big balls, like the hospital ball and other balls, are usually intense. The Parish Art Museum gives a big party. So very large entertainments are done for charities, but people still entertain, for 200 or 300 on the back lawn,
Got you. You mentioned the servants sort of going away in the 40s. One of the watchers had a question: why did the servants have to remain hidden? Is it something about not wanting to be showy?
Well, it was in many ways we're in an era where everybody had a place, and the servants, it's for those who've watched Downton Abbey or watch, people. I get it all the time, and people are very on my Facebook groups. We always love the downstairs life and the upstairs life. And you have like the old series upstairs, downstairs. You have Downton Abbey. You have the Gilded Age. It's funny, every era has its sort of story about the upstairs, downstairs, and people love hearing about the servants' rooms and the attics and the basements. And yes, they really ran the houses. But the idea was there was this rule that they were the servants, and they weren't supposed to talk about the people upstairs, and you really weren't supposed to, there's always stories where, the daughter of the owner of the house runs away with the chauffeur, there's a big scandal and so on, or the son marries the maid, and there's all that in the past, and as it works out, of course, so it is a different era. I mean, in many ways they felt that, you had to marry in your own class, and that's once again the Gilded Age story where, you don't marry the new money because they're not as, well trained in the way of living or from the right families or schooling or background. Yes, it was a very, very different era. And today we look back and it seems so horrible, but it just unfortunately was the times. And
yeah. Another question, since this era spans so many technological changes, electricity, refrigeration, etc., what were the most striking effects on building design in the Hamptons?
Well, in the Gilded Age, obviously, because you don't have air conditioning, and we all know we don't have air conditioning, we're all uncomfortable. As much as I would love to go back to the Gilded Age, I think I'd like to visit because I happen to like air conditioning very much. Unless I was on a marble house on the ocean, but even then, I give them the picture I showed at the Metal Club, where they were all sort of sitting in their linens and heavy clothing, and oh my God, how one ever survive in those times? But they did, and but in many ways, people ask also about these houses why they're gone. Technologically, they were built to be better than the houses they sort of were inspired by in Europe, the castles and palaces and so on, and not so much in the Hamptons, but large single-stall houses. And the idea was that when the 40s came around and you had the international style and the Bauhaus style and all that steel and glass, they thought of these Gilded Age buildings as being bad imitations of other historical buildings, and they really weren't original American architecture, and that that's like with Penn Station, they just felt that was a copy of some classical building from Rome. I mean, it wasn't original architecture. I mean, we look back now, wish we still had Penn Station, but still. So the architectural community of the 40s didn't feel that these houses were worth saving. There's always, fortunately, as you mentioned with the pandemic, the funny thing about the pandemic, not that there's anything funny about, but you know what I mean, is that a lot of big Gilded Age houses that had been sitting in the market for many years all started to sell during the pandemic because people wanted country houses to have their little place to get away.
Wow.
And so a lot of that in Newport and other places where these large houses that have been sitting really started to be, because they were going to become more family compounds and people wanted a house in the country more. And so there's still quite a few for sale, but some of the bigger houses were. But technology, the new houses were built out of steel and the best electricity and plumbing and all that. And but I had to say a lot of the shingle-style houses in the Hamptons were really just meant to be summer houses, and a lot of them weren't even insulated. So they didn't feel a need to. They had 5 other houses, so that's just where you go from so-called Memorial Day to Labor Day, which doesn't really hold up anymore. Summer doesn't begin at Memorial Day and Labor Day anymore, especially in the Hamptons, which pretty much is the only time it's ever not busy is January.
Yeah, it's a magical place, and you can see why they wanted to build out there, why it's so popular. I guess the location is a golden rule in real estate.
I have to say the ocean's still there. And also air conditioning certainly took away the awnings. I've been in those houses, which out there, even when I was working on the book, that during the week they were chilled to freezing because in case someone may show up, they were all running and fully staffed and whatever. I mean, they have a small staff, but the idea, everything was there in case someone wanted to come out for the midweek. And the gardens were, I mean, if you want to get a glimpse of maybe you had the perfection of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was about people like old houses, and they think that sort of old money look is where the wallpaper's falling off and it's held together with Scotch tape and thumbtacks and other things. I've been to a lot of old deteriorating houses, but the Gilded Age was all about dazzling and everything. Whether it was a huge house or an older money house, it was all perfectly maintained. The stories of the ladies with their white gloves going up on ladders, touching the top of picture frames and made them make sure the maid has dusted up there or something. And so it was all about really dazzle. All the brass was always polished. I mean, so if one wants to get a glimpse of, certainly not the scale, if you go on a garden tour that happens, you'll be amazed at the perfection of the gardens. I mean, there's not a wilted flower anywhere. Of course, if they know it's on a garden tour, they certainly make sure the day before. But I don't think I've never been in a garden that happens at a really beautiful garden where there's a wilting dead plant anywhere. And if something doesn't make it during the week, they just rip it all out and it's all brought in again for the weekend.
Right. Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Gary. We are 15 minutes. Yeah, we're 15 minutes over. And so we unfortunately do have to end, but we thank you very much for your program. Yeah, I noticed you have a couple more subjects you cover, like Newport and Fifth Avenue in the Gilded Age. Do you want to talk about those briefly before
Yes, I
we
do.
end?
Well, I have to say, well, one, it's a battle to save houses. But my idea is that with all the social media and the things that I've done, and even this Hamptons book, many of these houses were long gone before the book. And the book does bring back to life, like houses like Walden Manor. No one goes by, you see the great gates on Gin Lane, but had no idea what's there. One might think that the pool house was the mansion. And everything I do, whether it's what I call the Fifth Avenue mansions, the lost mansions on Fifth Avenue, lost Long Island, lost Newport, plus also, Newport and Long Island still existing, and some of the Fifth Avenue mansions, very few of them. But it brings back to those who never knew they existed, that they were there once, and people are dazzled and amazed that those houses once existed. And even in Newport, we would go to Newport and you would think, oh, it's all there. There's a lot of Newport houses that are demolished. I mean, fortunately, some of the biggest, grandest house exists, but there's a few big ones that really were torn down. So I like to think that so House of the Hamptons, the Newport, Long Island houses, they're all wonderful subjects. I did my architectural thesis on the Long Island Gold Coast mansions, and so that was the beginning of years of research, and each house has a story. So it's like I now and then I do lectures. I do one whole talk on Grey Gardens, one on Walden Manor, one on the Orchard, where I get into all the family details and all the stories. So each house is a story by itself, and it certainly could take up an hour. But it's hard to put them all together in an hour.
Right. Well, we really thank you. It was a very beautiful presentation. I learned a lot about what used to be. So we hope to see you again, and thank you everyone for attending this evening.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.